Hi Janites, and welcome back to the What the Austen podcast. Today I am joined by Helena Kelly, author of Jane Austen, The Secret Radical, and also her new book, The Worlds of Jane Austen. Today we're going to be talking about kind of the nuance in the grey that's found in Austen. So Helena is actually one of my favourite authors. Jane Austen, The Secret Radical, honestly, was such a big influence on me when I was writing my dissertation at uni. It's definitely one of my favourite kind of like critiques on like Austen's world, in the fact that it's actually not so picturesque in kind of this beautiful rose-tinted world that we often see depicted, I think, in modern day adaptations of the Regency era in Jane Austen's work, and obviously in kind of romance books that are written that are set in the Regency era. So what I really want to touch on today with Helena is not only the glorified perfect persona of Jane Austen herself, but how that's somehow been tied to the era, and how we kind of see it as this kind of picturesque, tranquil, wonderful time period with no drama or crisis or chaos, when actually there was so much going on in this era. It was an era of immense change and upheaval and confusion and curiosity. And so, so if that interests you, that is what we're going to be getting into today.
I feel like Jane Austen's world is often considered, I think the Regency era in general, is this like tranquil, beautiful time period. And I think Jane Austen herself has somehow managed to encapsulate that idea too. And what I've always loved about your work, Helena, is you kind of start to tear away that kind of idea slightly and just say, this was a time of a lot of change, a lot of unrest. There was a lot more going on than I think what we now see is like these Regency romances depicted very like kind of showcase. So I'm excited to get into this today.
Yeah, it is weird looking back on it, kind of like how Austen ever really got this reputation of writing these incredibly kind of pieces. They're like drawing room comedies, they're romances. It's all very, it's all so delicate. And people who I think don't necessarily know the novels that well have this real tendency to imagine that it's all like ballrooms and drawing rooms and everyone's sort of, people curtsying and bowing and this very sort of controlled and organized and very, very kind of genteel kind of whole world. And it's kind of not. I mean, the novels really aren't. And certainly the world that Austen was writing in, like, absolutely isn't. Like, the country, Britain is at war for almost her entire adult life, like 25 years. It's a war that Britain actually did really badly in for a really long time. There's the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, there's massive population growth, which freaks everybody out. Genuinely, they were really worried they were all going to starve to death.
Wow.
And so there's so much fear. It's easy, I guess, looking back to kind of look at the really quite totalitarian government that was in place for a lot of Austen's life, to look at that as being just kind of straightforwardly evil. But actually, they were terrified. Like, they were really scared. They were scared that revolution was going to come from America and France. They built these, invasion forces that never actually made it across, but they had plans.
Yeah.
The Regency itself, right? King George III is incapable of governing.
Right.
Everyone knows this. People know, right? It's not like this is some great secret. People talked about the fact that the king could not rule, and so that's why his son had to become regent, right? Like, it's revolutionary, it's scary, it's just very frightening and uncertain, and we have this view that everyone's just wafting around in pretty gowns.
I can't think of a better time to unpack the Regency era than now. I feel like there's a lot of parallels that are coming through that I'd love to get into. But the question I actually ask all my guests is, what got you into Jane Austen originally?
So I was talking about this with an academic at the big Austen conference a few weeks ago. I sort of said to him that actually I was relatively late to reading Jane Austen. So I grew up in a house with loads of books, but my mum always hated Jane Austen. She did Pride and Prejudice for not GCSE, O-level it would have been. And I don't think it was very well taught. And she hated her and wouldn't have her books in the house. And so my first proper introduction to Austen was the 1995 BBC Pride and Prejudice, obviously.
Mine too.
I was 14 when that came out. I was like, oh, there are some very nice men in this. This is quite good to watch. As I think happened for an awful lot of people, I really wanted to know what was going to happen at the end. I mean, I sort of knew, because it's, you know, it was billed as a romance, that they obviously were going to get together. What was going to happen to everybody else? And so I raced off to the library and I got the book out, and I sort of haven't really stopped since, to be honest. But I think in some ways it kind of helps to come to Austen as a fan, in a way, because then when I did English A-level, we did Mansfield Park, which is, as your readers will, it's a very abrupt change from Pride and Prejudice. Like, it's very, even though it obviously seems to kind of pick up the situation at the end of Pride and Prejudice, with three sisters making these very kind of different marriages, which then push their children essentially into different social classes. And then that's what you start off with at the beginning of Mansfield Park. But even so, I mean, it's so different, like tonally. Obviously, it was written probably quite a lot later. But it's just, and so, yeah, I guess I had the kind of fandom experience, but then I was also kind of having like, oh, okay, this is how does this fit in with that? Like, how are these two books by the same woman? Because they seem really different, and they are maybe quite different. But yeah, so it was two very different first experiences, I guess. And one was for fun, and one was kind of, you know, work-wise. But yeah.
Well, yeah, one of them's like when you start looking at it more seriously. I feel like that's so funny, because I feel like I went on like a similar journey where I was, you know, a fan. I love Austen, and I get to do all kinds of the nice, light and fluffy stuff as well. But whenever I was like, you know, studying, like when I was at uni, I was like doing my dissertation and stuff, I very much leaned into the more kind of like, okay, well, what are the kind of darker undertones that are coming out here? And you know, I said to you before we came on today, your book, The Secret Radical, like that was so pivotal. Like when I was writing my dissertation and everything, you know, I loved it. I thought it was so interesting. I was just like, actually, there are darker undertones, and you know, I kind of focused specifically more on the women characters that Jane Austen sacrifices for her heroines to have their happy ending. Like, what happens to all these other ones? I think it's so easy to just villainize a lot of these women, just be like, oh, they're like, this is the villain, or this is like the silly woman who did this or that. And it's just like, actually, no, like actually what she's talking about is the real women of the time.
Yeah, and I think Austen has this, she kind of has this fascinating combination of like moral judgment, because she clearly is quite like, this is bad and it should not have happened, and this is, you know, this is a moral judgment on you character. But at the same time, she's always very kind of clear-sighted about where her characters, even the less desirable ones, are coming from. So, oh yes, Mr. Collins is ridiculous, but you have this kind of couple of sentences where it's like, well, his father was awful, basically. So his father was basically illiterate, and was really kind of unfriendly, and it's an amazing kind of, it's this tiny insight into Mr. Collins's childhood, right, where he's clearly had a miserable childhood. But I mean, he is ridiculous, and he does kind of, you know, insist on reading Fordyce's sermons to young ladies, and then, but at the same time, that's where he's coming from, and she's always so interested in kind of planting people very precisely in kind of this social and kind of psychological soil, and it's always completely true. I think that they are, you can like, yes, I can see why you're like that with Willoughby as well. That kind of, you know, his selfishness, it comes from kind of, you know, the fact that he is rich and he's good looking and he's a man and he's got, you know, he's got landed property, and he never, if he'd been in a different situation, or he'd been brought up better, then he wouldn't be the kind of man he is. But he is the kind of man he is, and there's kind of no alternative. And when, you know, Darcy's kind of, when he looks back on himself, he's like, you know what, I was brought up really badly. Like, my parents, they gave me good moral principles, but they let me be like this, and they let me be like this, and those are wrong things that I will have to continue working against for the rest of my life, basically. And I think that's one of the reasons that she chimes with us so much, like, because it's such a modern idea of looking at kind of characters' personalities, right? You don't get that in people like Burney. You don't get that. You kind of have the very influential generation of women novelists ahead of Austen, who, you know, were great and who Austen loved, but they don't have that kind of modern idea of psychology and of why people are the way they are, and why all of them are the way they are, right? You know, you have it with Mrs. Bennet as well. she's completely uneducated, right? She was pretty, and so clearly her parents didn't bother to give her any education at all. And there's just stuff that she doesn't understand. And she's trying to kind of navigate her way through the world with the tools that she has.
Yeah.
And they're not actually quite adequate, but they're all she's got. So
yes, I think sometimes it's like the reflection on the reader as well. Sometimes when I read Austen, I think about, especially like with the podcast and everything, where I've kind of been deconstructing a lot of the characters over time. My views on so many characters have changed. I'm so more empathetic towards a lot of the characters now than I ever was when I first started reading Austen. I think that's because like when you start to get into the nitty gritty of it, you realize that she's like a behavioral psychologist. Like she's telling us like why these people have become who they are and what that means. And I think it makes you more empathetic. I mean, people say this about readers all the time. You read, you become more empathetic. But there's something about reading Austen and then going out in the world and seeing people like the people in the books and being like, wow, like I can actually understand why you may have got to this place in life. What things have happened to you that you kind of become this person.
It's extraordinary that she was able to do that, because I mean, whether it's simply a point at history that she's living at, where that kind of concept is starting to be developed. But I think people kind of argue about the genius of Jane Austen and what it kind of lies in. But for me, it's that incredibly kind of detailed, careful observation of individuals and the world around her, and kind of why things are the way they are.
I feel like there's probably something that's quite covert about the way that Jane Austen goes about this, though, which I feel like is in stark contrast to kind of the Regency era in general. Because like reading your book, The Worlds of like Jane Austen, you're talking about actually kind of like what was going on in the time period. In contrast to Austen, it seems very overt. Everything seems to be thrown out on the table, whether it's political ideas or just anything. It seems so, it's as if the pot boiled up and it was like so open in this time.
And you were saying earlier, it's this sort of, that there's a kind of correspondence between now and then. And I think very much so in terms of a kind of culture war, right, where you are on one side or the other, and every single topic has a sort of, oh well, that's the opinion we have on this, or oh no, actually this is what we think. And there's almost no room for nuance. There's no room for kind of the public debate kind of retreats into these two armed camps, basically. And you're either, anti-slavery, pro-women's rights, pro-political liberalism, or you're anti all those things because you see them as being kind of one horrible mess of like change and disruption. And it's absolutely fascinating. People were completely, especially the kind of younger generation, which of course Austen belongs to. Like Austen's basically the same age as people like William Wordsworth and Coleridge, and like she's the same age as them, right? And her this is, her older siblings are exactly the same age as some of them. So this is her generation, right? And they're like, oh yes, let's set up a commune and like share all our property. Let's do this. Oh, is it really necessary to get married? Just ideas that we think of as being kind of decades later on, they're right there. And there's this sort of, 10, 15 year period where basically everything is up for grabs, essentially. There's this really interesting passage in William Wordsworth's poem. I'm going to say, I think it's called The Prelude, although I probably should go and check that. There's this long, like, autobiographical one that he works on for years and years and years and doesn't publish till much later. But he has this sort of, he talks about how when he was young, basically every single idea got kind of dragged to the bar of reason, and you had to exactly, you were looking at absolutely everything. Like, is duty to your parents something that's natural? Well, let's explore what the kind of moral and philosophical underpinnings of it are. Is marriage something that is, should we have free love, or should we have kind of, monogamy? Like, what is the actual, why do we think this? Why do we do things this way? But most of those ideas kind of went back in the box, really. And then the 1820s and 1830s are fairly, well, more conservative. It's kind of difficult to realise quite how quite how kind of up for grabs and up in the air everything was, and it's and how close to the Austen family a lot of this came as well. Oh, you know, her life was like very quiet and nothing really happened to disturb its. I mean, she was certainly close to an awful lot of quite large and kind of
drama. They're on the fringes of so much drama,
dramatic, like melodramatic events, right? And close to kind of big political issues, right? She's not actually just sitting there in this little kind of, you know, small drawing room in a country village miles away, shut out from the world. Like all this stuff comes to her.
I feel like one of the best ways to realise how unsheltered Jane Austen was is to read some of her like juvenilia or shorter works, because I feel like, oh my gosh, like reading Love and Friendship is just a massive chaos. Like that is just one of the wildest stories. Even to the point that like parts of it, I remember because I actually read it in my book club as well, and like I was like, I'm convinced that somebody's been like killing off other people. Like there's like so much going on there, and these characters are quite unhinged.
But yeah, in the juvenilia, it's all there. Like the violence, the man traps, the, you know, people marrying each other and like throwing themselves onto each other's laps. But then our idea of the Regency is kind of weirdly refracted through the Victorian period as well, right? So we have this idea that they were all very proper. And I mean, obviously, anyone who's read, for example, Richardson, Pamela is just basically porn, or not far off. And yet that was a novel that young women were encouraged to read.
Is this again like that division though that we're talking about? Because I feel like it's wild to think this is a time period where, you know, there are books going like out there that are essentially, like you say, like they're essentially like porn, but then you've also got other books that are like the complete opposite, where it's like telling women how they need to show up, behave, incredibly religious. And again, it's that divide.
So Fordyce's Sermons to Young Women, which I'm sure your listeners will know is a conduct book. It's not religious sermons. It's all like how should teenage girls behave. He says, oh, you shouldn't read novels apart from Richardson. For us, I think, and not understanding that it was in some ways a much freer sort of time and a much kind of freer society.
It's like that thing, like how we see things now though. It's like how you have these singular voices who seem to rise above the crowd and they suddenly become like this authority on some topic. And it seems like in the Regency era, that exact same thing was happening. And I feel like that's where nuance dies as well, because it's like, if I don't agree with everything this one person's saying, I don't fall anywhere, and I'm open to attack by both sides.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's kind of a lot. Not an unrecognizable thing today, right? It's sort of that you need to adhere to every single thing on a certain side of the argument, or you're out there on your own, and people do kind of retreat from the centre, or from trying to kind of find a workable compromise on all kinds of subjects, right? And it's, you know, if you believe this, then you have to believe this, and if you believe this, that weakens your arguments on X, and it's just. Yeah, it's very...
the world of nonsense.
It's very, very similar, though. There's this sort of fascinating tendency to still believe what her relatives wrote about her. They're very unwilling to allow people to believe that she was, you know, ever writing anything. She never, you know, she didn't really want to get published. She just spent her entire life working at it for like 10 years. You know, the books like magically appeared from nowhere. She just kind of sat there, and then all of a sudden there was a novel. And how did that possibly happen? It's like that's not how writing happens. Especially when you're writing it by hand. I mean, the labour that's involved. Obviously, we don't have many of her manuscript works, but a lot of the ones that we do have, she kind of made them into little booklets, so that she was basically writing a little book as she went along. You know, she always. You know, the juvenilia as well, she's got these kind of fake dedications and things in there. Like, she was always clearly very, very, very invested in the idea of being a properly published professional writer. This was what she was going to do. This was what she wanted to do. You know, her family like, she wouldn't have published it if we hadn't persuaded her.
There's something wildly unattractive about ambition or something.
and that, you know, and like, obviously she, you know, whenever we suggested something, she changed it immediately, and, you know, she asked us for it. Again, did she though? There's this really, I think, quite astonishing tendency to just believe all of those really early stories as if just because they've been around for a really long time, they must be like super reliable.
That's the truth.
And they're actually, you know, some of them are quite clearly nonsense. There's a very definite resistance still to the idea that Austen is doing anything political or kind of is interested in the world around her. There's this there was an article in the Times on Thursday, which was also like, oh well, obviously we all know that Austen didn't write about the Napoleonic Wars. I'm like, persuasion, people. Persuasion starts when Napoleon is confined to the island of Elba, and it finishes the week that he escapes. Like, literally, that's, half the characters
are in the military.
What I mean, and it had that really famous quote from Winston Churchill, right, where he during the war he had pneumonia, I think, or bronchitis or something, and he was recovering in bed. His daughter read Pride and Prejudice to him, and there's this famous quote where it's like, oh, what calm lives they had, these people, like no worries about the crashing struggles of the Napoleonic Wars. I'm like, have you not realised that there's a regiment like that's just being quartered there, and then it goes to Brighton. Why do you think it's on the south coast, Churchill? It's such an astonishing kind of refusal to see what's there on the page. I find it quite amazing, actually, that we're still kind of having these. You can still have articles where people are like, oh yes, well of course she never mentioned this.
Yes, I do think part of that is what I consider like the most perfect PR strategy from her family, where she was like preserved in a way that I feel like it's only akin. The only person that I can think who's had something similar happen by her family is like Taylor Swift. Like the perfect machine that's just been created and will sustain, time and, any form of criticism that will come up. It seems to be stronger than that. And it's like, it's such a difficult balance to create something like that. But if you do it right, you create this almost saint-like character who just exists forever.
And has nothing to do with the actual woman or, the even the artifacts that she's actually creating, like the artwork that she's creating. It's separate from that, and it's above that, but it has its own kind of logic and I don't know, gravitational force or something, and it won't move. It doesn't matter how much evidence you throw at it. It's not shifting.
And somehow the Regency era has been tied to it, to this brand of Austen.
That is, everything's kind of wonderfully peaceful and perfect, and the Austen family were just great and they all got on really well. They also, the other thing that the Austen family did really successfully was to kind of get everyone to look away from the Austen relatives in a really quite fascinating way. We do remember the bit where they sent the son who had additional needs away. And, maybe he could get better and more kind of targeted care, but he was sort of living with his uncle who also had additional needs.
They're not mentioned much. They just seem to have been taken out of their history.
Literally in I've read books published in the 1970s and 1980s that don't mention George Jr. Austen's grandparents, bit of a scandal when they got married. It's not. There's a considerable social class difference between them. There's an age difference. She's quite a lot older. She's been married before. The evidence suggests, at any rate, that they ran off secretly and got married in London and then didn't tell anyone. That they sort of came back to the town in Kent where they were both then living and pretended that they weren't married, or certainly didn't publicly return as husband and wife. The whole of that family, that side of the family, is sort of tidied away in a really it's completely fascinating. I hadn't realised till I was kind of doing the research, and there's quite the extent to which that had happened. They don't get mentioned, even though Austen's granny was the daughter of a baronet, and her sisters all made really great marriages, very rich, very kind of well regarded. One of Austen's great aunts was a lady in waiting to George III's mum. So they're properly kind of it's the kind of relatives that you would have thought you'd be mentioning they get completely written out. And I think this is probably partly to do with the sort of dodgy marriage, because also they then have a daughter who appears, let's say, very promptly after the marriage. It's tight. She could totally be legitimate, but in that case, she is premature, which I mean happens, right? But those timings are tight. They're really tight for her to be legitimate. From what we can gather from kind of family letters and things, they weren't telling anyone they were married for about the first 4 months of her pregnancy. So, like, I think I can imagine that there must have been quite a lot of like local scandal that is maybe then affecting kind of subsequent generations of the family. Like maybe that's why there were always rumours about Austen's Aunt Philadelphia and like she was free with her favours, because this is how kind of sexual reputation worked at the time, right? That if you were a little bit dodgy, you kind of, as a woman, you sort of passed that.
It's like witchcraft.
Moral suspicion. No, but you kind of that people then looked askance at your daughters, maybe even your granddaughters, that this was, it was
hereditary.
Well, yeah, the people kind of acted as if it was. But also, of course, by the time the bigger family memoir was being written at the end of the 1860s, they were also, I suspect, super embarrassed by the fact that that whole branch of the family, all those family members, were Jamaican slave owners, basically. So they owned enslaved people in Jamaica. Absolutely, for a fact, I looked at their wills and there are enslaved people mentioned there. Because people always love to do this with Mansfield Park, don't they? It's like, oh, just because it's a property in Antigua doesn't mean it was necessarily, but yes, it does mean it was run on the labour of like kidnapped enslaved people. Like, it really does.
And like Mansfield Park gives like obvious karma issues. Like that house is covered in darkness. Like
it's bad. It's not a happy ending. It's a tragic moral failure. Like that's I think. But there are family connections who are coming to Jane Austen's dad's school. So she's kind of, she's growing up completely surrounded by people who think that slavery is absolutely fine. And the fact that she then is able to question that, I mean, it's kind of astonishing actually that she had because it's a very difficult thing to criticize people that you're close to, right? It's very easy to kind of be all morally upstanding about stuff that doesn't really touch your life.
Yes.
But for things, for stuff that comes right up to you, right? Money that not a ton of money, but some money that was coming into that household was from slavery. Her dad made his like slave owning cousins. One of his slave owning cousins a godfather to one of his kids. Like he clearly didn't find it a problem, right? So he clearly, or at least he was willing to overlook that kind of moral question in order to advance his children in society and kind of give them good connections and so on. So that Austen is willing to kind of broach the subject at all. We underestimate how kind of brave, kind of morally bold an action that is.
And in writing as well. Like that is, we know that like a lot of her letters were burnt and everything, but the novels that exist, like even the fact that those letters were burnt, there's something for me that I'm like, the fact that she wanted to put this in, she did, and she did it in a way that wasn't, I'm not putting this out there as some sort of, campaign that I'm going to upset everybody and they're going to destroy my book. She did it in such a way that she was like, I actually think my book can manage to survive this.
And she does it in such a clever way, because what she's actually doing is she's forcing the reader to kind of express, even if just in the safety of their own mind, their own moral judgment. Like, so when she has that, that famously evasive passage in the middle of Mansfield Park, where they're not talking about slavery, they're talking about slavery, and the dead silence opens up, and that then forces you as a reader, right, to be like, well, what was the conversation? What were they saying? What is the quality of that silence? What is, and you're brought face to face with it in a way without Austen telling you what to think, but you have to kind of confront your own your own moral heart. But of course her family's like, oh no, she wasn't doing that, we don't want her.
I think that's interesting, right? I mean, you're not necessarily guilty by association, but I feel like you are if you don't then address your own thoughts in opposition to what is around you. And I feel like how Austen does it, how she does it through the characters, it's like, what do you feel about this particular character, this particular individual? Because that says more about your morals and how you perceive them, and just like, and what's going on here. I feel like she makes people look inward based off like the similarities that they have to the people that she's writing about.
You need to work quite hard as a reader with Austen, and that's why we still love her, right?
It's why you can keep going back.
You can meet her over and over again, because obviously you always change, and so you're always
coming with fresh eyes. Yeah, 100%.
It's like the not stepping into the same river twice. It's always different.
And just on that topic, like it's so funny. One of my favourite ways to read Mansfield Park is to see the darkness in Fanny. And I remember when I first started talking about this on the podcast, like I had so much backlash that I was like, I was seeing something in Fanny that wasn't there. But when I read Fanny, like I see her jealousy, I see the influence that living in that household has had on her. And I'm just like, she has her own way of thinking, which compared to the people she lives with does have a moral superiority over it. However, like the way that she is about Mary, for me, I'm like, was nothing but a good friend to Fanny. She had no ideas about her feelings.
Poor Mary Crawford,
she's tortured.
What does she do that's so wrong? And of course Mary, like the Crawfords are more of those characters where, there are a couple of lines where Austen explains why they are the way they are, right? That they've been brought up in this completely, the uncle and aunt who raised them clearly had this totally toxic marriage, and they were, they had their own loyalties, and they kind of, split the kids up, and the children were clearly far too involved in everything that was going wrong, and there's a reason they had that kind of brittleness, and it's because A, they've been orphaned, which everyone likes to overlook, and B, just like Fanny, they've been sent off to live with an uncle and aunt who haven't looked after them very well. That, Mary Crawford is Fanny's mirror, right? Except she's, richer and better looking. But she's also, like, she's vulnerable too. Like, she just hides it better.
But also, how much do we glorify, like, the Elizabeth Bennets of the world when Elizabeth Bennet and Mary Crawford have so many similarities?
So many similarities. For Austen to be, like, recognising that and writing about it, like, 100 years before, well, I guess 80, 90 years before Freud is, Freud and Jung are starting to kind of, talk about ideas. Like, it's amazing. It's absolutely astonishing that she's doing that. But you're like, oh, wow, yes, that's what it is. That the way that you can map kind of, modern psychological understanding onto her character, like, it's extraordinary. Like, she must have just sat there, like, watching people and, like, listening to them and watching. And, like, sort of, sitting there in the corner, scribbling away, absorbing it all. Because it's amazing. Like, how did she even realise that was what was going on? But it clearly is, right?
Yeah, I feel like something that I was really picking up on in your new book as well is the thoughts about, like, the military and, like, how much that affected Jane Austen's life, and how you see so many of her characters are in the military. She has so many family members in the military, and just like how she just shows that actually even your position, like if you think about Wickham, like in the militia, what that in itself said about his character before we even knew his character, like there's just so much, like, nuance to Austen's work.
So it's really that the interesting thing with the militia, with Wickham in particular, is that obviously Jane's brother Henry was in the militia, and it was a bit sort of it's very much the cheap option. So obviously at this point, the regular army officerships, officerdoms, I don't know what you call them, officer positions. You buy them, basically. So there are little ads in the newspapers, and it'd be like, a major position in, like, X regiment is free, like, write to this agent, and so you buy them, and they are in depends how fashionable the regiment is, and, like, cavalry is more expensive, I think, than infantry, and obviously the higher up the the hierarchy, the more expensive it is. But yeah, you basically buy your way in. So it's a wonder the British Army managed to do anything at all, because it had, like, it did not reward expertise or like success in battle very much. I mean, it was possible to be promoted, but then someone might just buy in ahead of you. So it was basically what you did if your family didn't have enough money, or you didn't have enough money, but you still wanted to be in the army and, like, you know, be like glamorous, was that you joined a militia regiment. You became an officer in a militia regiment instead, which you didn't need to buy your way into. You could just kind of, you basically needed sureties, but you could. So this is what Henry Austen did. Like, he was like, yeah, I don't really want to be a clergyman, despite having spent a lot of time at Oxford. He'd sort of got to a point where he had to, basically, if he wanted to stay there, he had to qualify as a clergyman, and he didn't at that point want to do it. So he joined the Oxfordshire militia instead. And this sort of idea we have from Pride and Prejudice adaptations, the militia's all just, you know, handsome young men dancing around, and there's no kind of, you know, it's not about the war. It's a lovely, it's just, they're just like love interests. The Oxfordshire militia, and I talk about this in the new book, it actually mutinied, and they kind of, you know, attacked people and, like, took a ship in a river, and they, like, stole all this wine and food, and they had to the mutiny had to be put down by regular officers sent out, I believe, from Brighton, because that was where they used to hang out in the summertime for training. And they then, it's really quite traumatic, and we don't know whether or not Henry Austen was actually there to see this. But what they did is they got the whole regiment to kind of line up on the hills around this sort of shallow valley. And then the two ringleaders of the mutiny were made to kneel on the edge of their coffins. And then 12 people who'd been active in the mutiny were made to shoot them while everyone watched. Like, it's just, like, brutal, like, really, like, awful, like, medieval form of, like, discipline and punishment. Like, it's just, like, genuinely really quite upsetting as an idea that you would be, because obviously the people who were active in the mutiny would have been friends with the people who were leading it, and it's just, like, it's monstrous, right? And like I said, we don't know whether Henry Austen was there to see it, but he could well have been. And so, and I read that, I was like, how do we not know about this? How is this not central to kind of our understanding of what's going on in Pride and Prejudice? Because actually that militia regiment, that's kind of, you know, maybe it's even more dangerous. Maybe it's not just a case of, like, lots of young men in an area being a bit disruptive. Like, maybe there really is, like, a real fear of, like, oh, they're gonna revolt. So the militia officers are middle class, but the men are anyone who basically couldn't afford to avoid the lottery. So they are selected by lot, but you can insure against, you can like, there are all these insurance schemes that you can pay into if you have enough money to do it, and it's not super expensive, that then enable you to pay a fine, and they just move on to the next person. So everyone who's in the kind of main body of the militia is super poor, and
so you're automatically just put into the lottery.
Yes, basically.
Wow. And if you've got enough money, you can pay and not avoid it. But if you don't, you're forced into the position, essentially. Wow.
Mm-hmm. So they didn't have general conscription, but they did have, when they were raising militia strength, that was how they did it.
The predatory nature of Wickham in general, I feel like this is something that's totally overlooked in so many ways. I think, one, because I think in the adaptations, Lydia's always cast looking too old. Like, I want more than anything an adaptation that shows,
wasn't she?
She's a child. Like, I want this to be shown, because I feel like we really, when you read the book, where you see the adaptations and you see these actresses who, you know, are more age appropriate in terms of, like, making it not look as awful as it actually is. If you were to cast Lydia age appropriately, like, Wickham is a predator. This is a disturbing thing that Austen talks about in her book.
And it's, you know, it's always the case, I think, that she, like, there's a very clear, I mean, obviously it was legal, like the age of consent is 12, I think, for women. Yeah, I know, women, girls. But I mean, Austen's view very clearly is that if you're younger than 18, you are not, that's not okay, basically. That she seems to have a very clear age in her mind as to when she thinks is a sort of acceptable time for girls to start being considered kind of nubile, and it is not 15 for her. Like, that's it's bad men who go after 15-year-old girls. Well, one of the things that makes me cast a bit of a side eye at Colonel Brandon, because, you know, Marianne's only 16 when they meet, and well, she's nearly 17, isn't she? But that's really young. It's and he's a lot older, and it's, you know, I think there's meant to be an element of discomfort there. And he's like reliving his early infatuation with his cousin.
Also disturbing, but there we go. That's okay.
Like the psychological mess that is going on in Sense and Sensibility makes me like deeply upset. Every time I read the book, I'm like, no, all these relationships are awful. You all need so much therapy. It's all this, like, no, just don't do it. It's going to be awful. It's going to be absolutely terrible, because the two people who clearly actually get on are Colonel Brandon and Eleanor. And every time I read the novel, I'm like, no, can you not see this is the healthy, like, this is the healthy relationship for both of you. You can both kind of, you know, move forward into something that's kind of fully adult and, like, you know, leave the other stuff behind, and like this would be okay psychologically. Like, don't do the other ones. They're terrible. It's going to be, it's so like going to be like psychosexual disaster all round. Like, it's just bad.
If I start deep diving in that, we'll be here forever. But I think it's interesting you bring up Colonel Brandon, because in your book as well, like, you mention his military links and his links to essentially like to the slave trade as well. Like, this is Austen's heroes are not always immune to what was going on at the time. And I'd love to talk about Colonel Brandon and then also touch on how Wentworth made his fortune.
The dates in Sense and Sensibility probably don't quite make sense. So obviously listeners will know that we are fairly confident that Sense and Sensibility was written quite early. So originally kind of written in the 1790s, that fits with a lot of the internal references. And that it's then possibly rewritten from letters, but, you know, maybe not. And she cuts quite a lot out, both in Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, to make them kind of 3-volume length. And I suspect that actually I think there's quite a lot in Sense and Sensibility that just hadn't been properly edited. So it's a little, there are some kind of characters who kind of only appear once, or only mentioned once and then disappear. They all get cut out. So there's Colonel Brandon's sister, who kind of sort of appears once, or is mentioned once and then vanishes again. The dating issues with exactly when Brandon goes to India and how long he's there and when he comes back, which they don't quite gel in the text. It doesn't quite make sense. He is sent / goes to India, and it probably what the one of the things that the East India Company did. I mean, they had their own armies, obviously, because they're it's basically a sort of, I guess, a combination of a like massive multinational conglomerate and a militia, like a private military contractor, sort of combined together. Because of course there are other East India companies as well. There's a French one, and there's a Portuguese one, and there's a Dutch one, and they were all kind of fighting over the various Indian princely states as the Mughal Empire collapsed.
They do it for the crown, though, of like their particular.
No, they do it for
it's
themselves.
Independent. They just do it for themselves.
They're independent companies, and obviously lots of people in all the like there's obviously lots of tax income, and obviously lots of rich and influential people in all those countries have bought into the various East India companies. This isn't actually the British government at this point. They're not doing it. I mean, individuals in the British government are involved, but this isn't actually a state-sponsored thing at this point. This is a massive private company with its own armies, and there's starting to be a kind of interlink into the state, because they also hire regular army regiments and start fighting wars with the it's super complicated. And there's a sort of, and then the states start fighting as well. So France and Britain start fighting in India, but they're fighting sort of for their respective kind of companies have sort of taken over and built these little fiefdoms, and it's
weird privatization, like kingdoms within kingdoms. So strange.
Yeah, it's but I mean, I guess, and again, quite similar in a sense to all the kind of private companies and things like companies like Blackwater and the Russian one, where they're all kind of they're being paid to go and do stuff in various African countries, and it's a similar sort of situation. As you get kind of into the latter part of Austen's life, and then kind of afterwards, then the state kind of takes over. It takes the East India Company over and kind of makes it back to Colonel Brandon. So he probably goes out there in one of the regular British regiments. It's probably the case that they're essentially hired to go there, or it may be, because we're a little vague about the timings, but it may be that he's out there for one of the kind of wars between the British and the French that kind of goes on top of this sort of, I guess, market share fighting. It's colonial, it's exploitative, it's some bad European impulses. Let's put it that way. Jane's Aunt Philadelphia, so her dad's sister, one of her dad's sisters, was either sent out or decided to go out to India, and she had what we think was essentially an arranged marriage. A guy who was had gone out there as a kind of doctor to the company, to the East India Company, but had then kind of set up in business, as many people did. And they became really good friends with a man called Warren Hastings, who became really, really powerful in the company and became like Governor General. There's this sort of, like I said, there's this sort of slide from being a private company into being a kind of state-sponsored thing, and it's sort of happening in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He's not a delight, Warren Hastings. He's a bit of a monster, and he very much helps the East India Company kind of consolidate its position, and makes some morally questionable decisions while he is fighting those wars, and is impeached back in Britain. So he's kind of called into the House of Commons and put on trial for basically, I guess, like crimes against humanity almost. So there's he's accused of like stealing quite a lot of money from one of the princely families. He's accused of kind of creating this sort of putting someone in a position of power who then like really mistreats all the local farmers and kind of tortures them and so on. And there's quite a long list of issues, and he's like the trial drags on for like a decade. So it starts when Jane Austen is about 10, and it goes on till she's about 20. The British government is sort of asking itself what it does. Is this what it wants to be happening in India? And it then uses it as well in a way as a sort of justification for moving from that as an essentially kind of almost uncontrolled private company to a sort of state colony. So Warren Hastings was super close to Jane's Aunt Philadelphia. So there were rumours at the time that they were lovers. And whether this is actually true, we don't in fact know. People will be like, oh yeah, they definitely are. But of course, given that Philadelphia's parents had this very questionable marriage, and that her eldest sister, who in fact died as a baby, had arrived kind of so soon after the marriage, I wonder whether they were like, oh, like mother, like daughter, and whether they were always kind of people just thought that because her mother had been a little bit dodgy, she was too. And so I don't know that even the fact there were rumours contemporaneously necessarily tells us that they were lovers, but they were certainly close and very friendly. And Warren Hastings was godfather to Philadelphia's daughter Eliza. She names her son after him after the trial started. So the trial starts, she has her baby, and she calls him Hastings because she's like, this is my show of support for you.
Hey, is this the same cousin Eliza who then is very close to Austen, goes to France, is kind of this like prominent figure in her life? Wow.
It's Henry Austen, because they married cousins then.
Yeah, she marries Henry Austen after her husband dies, doesn't it? Well, doesn't her husband die under really odd circumstances?
Her first husband is guillotined. Yes. So her first husband claimed to be a nobleman and almost certainly wasn't. But he was an opponent of the revolution, so he was kind of anti-revolutionary, and he got himself guillotined in the Terror. It's really close to home. A lot of this stuff, much closer than we realise. We kind of have this. We're talking about this idea that she's, shiny, peaceful, rural English culture, English comfort, that kind of idea, and really, actually, she's got all this input from all over the world, from nascent empire. And there's a lot of kind of, big political stuff that is right next to her, essentially. So the idea that she might have put it into her novels is not actually that ridiculous. But anyway, to go back to Colonel Brandon, like people were not actually in Britain, because this was before we were pretending that it was the white man's burden, and we were obviously making stuff great for India, building railways. Because this was before that, so we don't have the kind of imperial justification going on. There was actually quite a lot of moral disapproval of the East India Company and the people who went out to India and then came back really rich. And it was not actually a great thing to do socially. They were very looked down on. There was a lot of people. There was, I think, quite a large degree of moral discomfort as well. That it was not seen as a kind of straightforwardly great thing that was going on. Hence the impeachment of Hastings in a way. And so to have Colonel Brandon go to India and spend time in India in the army in some kind of nebulous position. I mean, what's he doing there? Is he like who is he fighting? Who is he defending? Where is he? And there's this fascinating bit when Willoughby, obviously very bad in some ways, but he has this he can't stand Brandon, and that's partly to do with the fact that he seduced Brandon's cousin once removed, / foster daughter. But it also does quite genuinely seem to be that the connection to India offends him. So he sort of says, oh, well, he has all these boring stories. And, I'm sure he will tell us about nabobs and gold moors and palanquins. So that he associates Brandon and India with what are sort of symbols of like luxury and excess, but also of kind of corruption, because the family, the Indian princely family that Warren Hastings was accused, had stolen from, it was the family of the Nawab of Oud. So to have that kind of princely title, Nawab is an Indian princely title, to have that kind of in there again, in like you're really kind of, it's the equivalent of walking right up to your cousin / sister-in-law and being like, how are we feeling about this? Like, what is your moral position on this? Are you happy with the source of your Indian fortune? Are you happy with your strong relationship with your godfather, who almost certainly, he was found mostly not guilty, but he did all this stuff. Because the comment comes from Willoughby, we have a bit of a tendency to ignore it, because we're like, oh, well, Willoughby he has no moral compass. He's off, seducing and abandoning 15-year-old girls. But actually, that it seems to me like there is some moral judgment there. And the fact that it comes from Willoughby shouldn't blind us to the fact that that is probably an accurate moral judgment, that to go to India, to partake, to be part of this program that is moving from just a kind of, rampantly financially exploitative one into a kind of more imperially exploitative one. That's That's a moral judgment on you.
This is fascinating. It just makes me think she's just the master of looking at the grey. Like, it isn't. And again, like you were saying, people are often trying at the time period are forced into these categories. Are you like, is it good or bad? But it's like within one individual, you can have such differing opinions on different topics that it's almost impossible to fall on the side of good or bad. You have elements of good within you,
so
but
in Mansfield Park, you know, the one person who's like, well, obviously, if cousins are brought up as brother and sister, it's morally impossible for them to get together. Basically, they'll never look on each other romantically because it's completely unnatural. Mrs. Norris,
who's the worst.
You know, obviously they weren't aware that cousin marriage was problematic, but this kind of idea that if you've been raised as siblings, that will obviously kind of block off any idea of kind of that maybe ought to be true, right? That maybe should be true. And I always feel like Fanny's running away from kind of sexual attraction with Henry Court. Like, she clearly is attracted to him, right? She clearly does. She is drawn to him, very much against her will. But she doesn't want to be. She wants a secure, safe. She wants what she's known because, you know, because she's had this disruption and because she's had this upheaval. She doesn't step fully into adulthood.
Yeah, I was just about to say, like, it seems to be an aversion to womanhood for herself in going with her cousin who she's grown up with. She's only ever been perceived as a child by him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, it's an attempt to kind of recapture her relationship with William, that kind of fraternal, sororal bond. She's probably pregnant at the end of the novel. Like, she's the one character where we seem to have a hint that she's, you know, she's expecting. Right? They have been married long enough to feel the want of the increase in income, which suggests that she's expecting a baby. She's clearly so uncomfortable every time anyone raises the possibility of her being sexually mature woman, right? Nay, Fanny, do not turn away about it. It is but an uncle. You really must harden yourself to the idea of being worth looking at. She doesn't want to do it, right? She's so profoundly uncomfortable with it. When she goes home to her birth family, and her father kind of, you know, hugs her. It's the only hug in Austen's novels, so it's a very, like, it's a, you know, when the Brontes use the word hug, it's always very, very, very physical. It's a much kind of fuller body thing than we think of it as being. And, you know, he's like, oh, I'll have to think about finding you a husband. And she's freaks her out. Actually, I'm like, oh, what a mystery. It's not a mystery at all. Like, her mother's been pregnant her entire childhood. And
she was sent away. She's been treated terribly by her family. Like, there's a retreat within her. I can understand.
That actually, and actually maybe that's even more of the tragedy at the end, that having seen her mother basically be physically exhausted, you know, poor animal, she will be quite worn out by the time she is 30. That's what Austen says in one of her letters about like one of her niece's friends. I read the ending of Mansfield Park as like profoundly tragic. Like, that it's a moral failure. It's a kind of sexual romantic failure. It's a social failure where they're all kind of retreating from the world back inside Mansfield Park and pulling up the drawbridge. But it's also, you know, the thing that she was so scared about happening, right? It's happened. It's an awful ending. It's bad. It's sad. It's, you know,
by the one man that she thought was going to preserve her innocence as well. There's something so, honestly, Edmund, everyone knows who listens to the podcast, I have such issues with this man, such issues. I go on rants forever about him, but
I'm with you. I don't like him.
I just
I don't dislike him quite as much as Edward Ferrars and Colonel Brandon.
Oh, I'm the same with Edward Ferrars. Oh my goodness. Honestly, don't even get me started on either of those.
That is a man who needs some therapy, like really serious therapy. Like, what is wrong with him?
The absolute neglect of the women in his life is a patriarch and a patriarchal system is honestly disturbing to me. Like, the fact that...
Well, I mean, is he a patriarch, though? Because his mum holds the purse strings, doesn't she?
But he's got to inherit... He wants a wife. He's got, like, sisters. I don't know. There's just something about the duty and, like, taking up the baton. Like, the reason his mum has to do all of this work is because he's just completely away with the fairies. The work that Eleanor, married to him, will have to inherit herself. Like, she has a life of suffering ahead of her with Edward in a way that she would have had with Colonel Brandon.
You know how you kind of develop theories about Jane Austen characters that aren't necessarily like fully based on the images. They're just like, it's just like a feeling. I think that Edward is the reason that Edward's dad left his money and his estate the way he did. Like, I think he was like, that is a wrong un. Let's hope he improves. That's the reason he doesn't go to public school. Right? Why does he not go to public school? Right? He's sent away to this very kind of like small scale boarding school / private tutor setup, but not making any of the kind of, useful social contacts that you make at public school. But his dad's left all the money and the estates in his widow's control, and you had to go to some trouble to do that. Like, that requires quite a lot of conscious effort. Like, it doesn't happen automatically, right? So I have a theory that in some of those edited out chapters of Sense and Sensibility, there's in fact a full explanation of the fact that Edward's dad had a big downer on him and was like, it's not going to end well. He's not the son and heir that I was looking for. Also, that he would be a terrible patriarch. So I need to make sure that actually the other kids are provided for as well, because he's not going to do it, right? So, and their mother is actually very generous financially, right? She's very generous. She's controlling, sure, but she's also, she gives them lots of money. She gives them presents when they go when they go up to London. Yeah, I mean, is Edward's mistreatment of the women in his life a revenge on his mother? Is it a sort of, is it thwarted male rage at the fact that actually this woman is in charge of what happens and he's not, and so he kind of takes it out on making other women dance to his tune?
I think it's total neglect just on his part. I just think he's not even there. I don't even think he's calculated enough to think of it as revenge. I think it's...
let's face it, he's not a clever man.
No, I mean, Eleanor is what the most incredible character. She spends so much of the novel providing for the people in her life, the women in her life who've been neglected, only to marry a man who will make her do that same job for the rest of her life. Yep. It's so tragic. It breaks my heart.
No, like every time I read it, I'm like, no, don't do it. Don't do it. I don't want Marianne to marry Brandon either. I'm like, don't do it. For me, it's the most frustrating Austen novel because it's the only one where I read it and I really, 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 really want the ending to be different. Like, I'm every time I'm like, no, you're doing it again. And obviously, yeah.
You're doing it again. Why is the ending not different?
Sorry, just remembered, you said earlier you wanted to talk a little bit about Captain Wentworth
and how he made his fortune,
his moral greyness. Yeah. So basically, being in the Navy, absolutely terrifying. I'm gonna attempt to use the terminology that I feel like I have learned from the Patrick O'Brian, Aubrey and Maturin novels, which I love, but where I do admit I kind of skate over all the halyards and whatnot. So basically what happens, you've got these two big wooden ships, you've got like a British one and a French one, say, and in order to fight, you need to actually get close to them. And so you're either aiming in a ship-on-ship kind of combat, you're either aiming to sink the other ship, thus drowning everybody, or to close with them, like grapple the two ships together and board, and then like kill so many people that they surrender. Terrifying in a way that we can't even begin to encompass, I think. And so basically, in order to persuade people to do it, they offered quite generous payments if you sank an enemy ship or took it, like brought it back into port. And everyone got some, so the kind of, captain and the admiral would get quite a lot, but everyone that's on the ship gets a kind of generous payout if you manage to defeat another ship. And this is basically to make you do it, right? Because otherwise it's such a terrifying prospect that I think people actually just wouldn't have done, right? I mean, like, oh, I can't see any ships, can't see any enemy ships there. It's like Nelson putting the telescope to his wrong eye, but yeah. So they basically made sure that everyone had quite a significant financial incentive. The Navy's set up differently to the Army. So the Navy, you don't buy your way into. You join often as a very young man, as you go into the officer track. 12, maybe younger than 12. Obviously, the brothers who were over either side of Jane, so Frank and Charles, they were both put into the Navy. Partly, one suspects, because their cousin had married a naval officer. She's probably the inspiration for Anne, incidentally. So her husband was a naval hero. Basically, he took a French ship. It was a very significant victory. He got a knighthood for it. So basically, the Austens, who always had a bit of an eye to the main chance, were then like, oh yes, let's put Frank and Charles in the Navy. This will be fantastic. And in fact, their cousin's husband did assist their careers quite a lot. So basically, you kind of do this and you work your way up to becoming captain, basically, and that's a combination of your officers liking you and being really lucky. But then once you become a captain, you just keep going up. People love to say that Frank Austen was like an amazing sailor because he became admiral of the fleet, so he gets to the very, very top. But he also lived into his 90s.
I was going to say, maybe he just had like good genes, just lived a while.
I think he was actually very well regarded. But it was also just a case of like hanging on in there. But prize money was basically your big attraction, really, because that was how the only way you were going to become rich in the Navy. And it's rewarding kind of skill and bravery and having a good relationship with your men so that they will follow you onto that other ship with, like, boarding axes and swords and whatnot, and pistols and so on. But what seems like quite a vague reference to the £25,000 that Captain Wentworth, I think it's 25. It's 25, not 20, isn't it? That he has made in the war. That's basically from attacking other ships. That's from killing people. That's from firing his cannon, ordering the cannon to be fired, I guess, not actually firing them himself, into other ships. The number of deaths in seafaring battles, very, very high. There's all sorts of like horrific things that can happen to you. And so this 7.5, 8 years that he's been away from Anne, he's been going around killing people, right? And I'm sure that's his job, but he has been going around killing people and, sinking ships and throwing his men into battles that they will die in. There's a darkness there too. Like, it's not just glamorous. I think Jane Austen did have a genuine, like, much more respect for the Navy than the Army. Like, I think you can see that quite clearly from her novels. She's still aware, I think, of what it actually entails. And I'm not just sailing around an empty ocean, which is quite dangerous enough as it is in a sailing ship. And then they are trying to kill people. And if they succeed in killing people, then hooray, they can get some money. We talk a lot, and rightly, about the kind of tainted sources of money from kind of colonial endeavours, from slavery. But there are other ways of tainting, like having tainted fortunes, right? And it's not completely kind of great source for it.
And we think about the fact that Anne obviously is persuaded out of marrying Wentworth when he was kind of more of this like pure innocent being who'd not done anything. He has no money, but he also hadn't, gone into this life of war. And then she accepts it and is with him once he's got this money, but this money's tainted by the deaths of loads of people. Yes, as you say, it's his career, that was his job, he was in the military. But at the same time...
They are kind of defending against the French, I guess, a lot of the time. But not always. Sometimes it's trading ships that they're taking. It's not a kind of morally... As you say, it's not morally pure. It's certainly not as straightforward. But prize money goes on until World War One.
Wow, my goodness.
I was amazed to read this. I was like, wow, that's incredible. But yeah, World War One.
It's mad, but also like the difficult, like I'm saying that about Anne, like choosing Wentworth and stuff, but frankly, for like a lot of women, marriage is your way, that is your security, that's how you're going to get your security. And I remember a lot of my dissertation that I talked about at the start, where I was like using a lot of your book to kind of use as a reference for, I had this whole chapter that was about like the how self-preservation and self-promotion is the same side of is one coin. You know what I mean? Like we try and say like this person's glorified because, like Charlotte Lucas, she married for self-preservation. There's something such more moral about that than say, someone like Isabella Thorpe, who abandons her fiance for self-promotion. She tries to go for something better. And it's like, is it though? Because realistically, like the need that woman has is the same. I don't think you can condemn a woman for wanting to try and make the best of that situation.
No, they're in I'm like, I feel the same for kind of Lucy Ferrers and for, Augusta Elton, like all these women, Mary Crawford, all these women that we kind of love to hate or feel as if we should hate because the heroines dislike them. But actually, you know what? They're in a certain situation. This is a society where money matters, right? If you want to preserve it from want, snagging the best husband you can get. Charlotte Lucas is not making a silly decision, right? She's like, okay, Mr. Collins is an idiot, but he seems nice. And people overlook. I mean, yeah, he's ridiculous. I mean, sure, he is. He's ridiculous. He's not attractive. He's not Mr. Darcy. He's not even Mr. Bingley. But actually, you know what? He has been brought up by a father who hasn't been speaking to the Bennets. Right? They've had some significant falling out. Clearly, presumably a kind of legally connected one. He decides, once he's kind of independent and an adult and has his own job and his own kind of secure, he's like, no, I want to go and make peace because I'm a clergyman and because I am in line to inherit their father's estate, I will offer to marry one of the daughters. Unspoken in that offer is that he will give a home to Mrs. Bennet and to any of the girls that remain unmarried. Actually quite a pure and generous and disinterested and Christian thing for him to be doing. That fundamentally he's not a bad man. Like, why are we so much more forgiving of Willoughby, for example, and yet so down on Mr. Collins, who is trying to do the right thing? There's no benefit to him to marrying one of his cousins.
But isn't that so true of real life as well? How easy it is. I mean, we see it in like court system situations that happen now, how easy it is for these, I mean, I think I'm thinking about like one of the most recent cases, that whole the sexual assault case that's been, thrown out of the courts about was it the ice hockey players or what have you, and how they've totally written off. And it's like, these are obviously, successful athletes. We
don't want to ruin their lives. It's just a little episode. Sweep it under the carpet. They'll be like, no, you've caused harm.
But yeah, it's this lovable rogue thing that it's just like, again, like Austen really touches on something here, that this just how easy it is for these like narratives to run through time. And it's the ridiculous Mr. Collins who has a lot to offer, but he doesn't have charm. He's not very good looking. He's very average. And average is somehow more unattractive than villainous behaviour.
Yeah, there's that fascinating scene at the end of Sense and Sensibility, isn't there? Even when I'm reading it, like, still the disappointing ending that I was hoping wouldn't happen this time. Where Willoughby turns up and Eleanor, rather than slamming the door in his face and telling him to do one, she lets him in. She lets him justify himself. And there's this fascinating bit which is like she can feel herself wanting to forgive him. And because he's good looking and he's voluble and he's, he can explain himself, and the social setup and the social privilege that he has makes her want to make him comfortable again, essentially. And Austen is like, no. Actually, no. This is not... He doesn't get a happy ending. He's so morally wizened that he's not even capable of realising that he's not having a happy ending, because, he doesn't have the kind of greatness of soul that is required for him to become properly remorseful. He can't even do that. It's astonishing that those two, that kind of ending of the book, although displeasing to me in other ways, the way that he attempts to kind of puff himself up and morally justify his behaviour and be the person who is the victim. And then Austen kind of punctures that, and she's like, no, actually, this story isn't about you. Given the novels that Austen grew up reading and the behaviour that those novelists were willing to forgive, you think of the way, Mr. B behaves in Richardson's Pamela. Basically tries to rape the heroine all the way through, but then at the end he proposes to her, and so it's all okay. Right? Or Burney's Evelina, where, again, the hero's very judgmental, very controlling, blah, 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 just very difficult man. But at the end they get married, so it's all okay and it's perfect. And that Austen is very much not willing. She's not willing to do that. She's not willing to kind of overlook bad behavior.
Yeah, and you know, this is why I love reading like your work so much, because I feel like it always like it does lean into like that question, right? Across all characters, like it always gets me thinking more about it, and I'm just like, at the end of the day, was Austen putting any of her characters on the pedestal? And I don't think she was. I think she was like, people in general are complex, and you know, people will have, because look at Lucy Steele. Lucy Steele gets everything she wanted. Like sometimes Austen is like, you know, the pendulum doesn't always swing the way you think it's going to. And I think she shows that in her book. She's like, actually, you know, I can have a moral stance, you can have a moral stance, but at the end of the day, life will flow how it's going to flow. And the best thing you can do is kind of go through life and strive to be the best version of yourself, which I think we see with someone like Anne Elliot, for example. And you know, and hope that you get the scenario that you want for yourself. But then it's up to the observer then, isn't it? Everybody's going to look upon your life and look upon these characters and have their own opinions of it. And what I love about Austen is I think she was totally open to that in a way that I feel like the perfect PR campaign that I talk about is attempted to try and kind of blur off.
Yes. I mean, even in the letters that we have, right? I mean, Cassandra, we're pretty certain, destroyed a lot. One of Austen's nieces destroyed quite a few letters as well. Even in the ones that we have, I mean, there are some passages in there that make you absolutely clap your hand to your mouth. You know, the one about the woman who suffers a stillbirth, right? Because she happens to look at her husband unawares, and you're like, wow. I mean, that's however you read it, whether it's a reference to kind of, you know, like domestic violence, or like what is the subtext there, which obviously we can't really follow completely. Like that is a shocking thing to commit to a piece of paper. Really kind of cutting personal comments about other people, you know, references to a distant cousin who got divorced, obviously very shocking at the time and very rare. And she sees her at a dance in Bath, and they're sort of, you know, they're clearly like not on speaking terms because she's now divorced, and so she's kind of, you know, beyond the pale. But she's like, oh yeah, and I was like, no, they were, they kind of see the family, and there's and people aren't quite sure which one the divorcee is, and Austin's like, no, I reckon it's that one. At the same time, she's sort of like, yeah, she got divorced. So what? Having, you know, ran off with her first husband and then ran off with the guy she left her husband for. It's like that's something that she's like, in this letter she's like super chill with, and yet that's a letter that survived. What was in the ones that got destroyed? Is it just personal stuff? Is it political stuff? Is it criticisms of family members? Is it like what was going on in there that the ones that survived were considered acceptable, and the ones that because there's, you know, there are some properly shocking moments in them, like even the ones that we have. This sort of ability or insistence on like reading her against the grain. So she's sort of like, you know, oh, like Austen never talks about sex. And I think you'll find she does. You know, oh, Austen was so innocent. Austen didn't understand men. I'm like, again, like, what is it we are? But you know, she had 6 brothers, and she grew up in a boys' boarding school. Like, I think the idea that she's some kind of like sheltered spinster aunt who like fainted every time a man walked near, like, I mean,
her writing of like,
she grew up in a house full of teenage boys.
Yeah, her writing of male friendships is so accurate that I don't think it could, like, I'm like, no, like, she writes male friendships in such a compelling and accurate way in male behaviour that I'm just like, she's not oblivious to the behaviours of men.
The family memoirs were like, oh yes, you know, she never spoke an unkind word. I'm like, well, she certainly wrote them. It's so, oh, and you know, she was definitely like purely Anglican, unlike our cousin who's quite evangelical, and also like our other cousin who's a little bit just pretend that there's this image of her that her family wanted to promote, and that people for some reason like are still buying into. You're not seeing what she's written. You've got this idea in your head of who she is and what she's doing, of this kind of weird Regency like theme park, you know, like Bridgerton. if they've got rid of slavery in the Bridgerton world, where is all the money coming from for those luxurious parties? Like you say, there's this shiny kind of Teflon version of Austen, and it seems to kind of throw everything off. Doesn't matter how many times people repeat it, still doesn't stick. It doesn't stay there.
And it's fascinating because everybody can make their Austen, and this is something that I love in when I'm speaking to different authors who have written books inspired by Austen. I love reading their Austen because there's always difference and nuance to it. However, I also think it's fascinating because how many people can be such a beloved and shaped person, but yet such a blank canvas that anybody can project their version of who she is upon her. And I find it honestly really incredible. I like I said, the only thing I can think it's akin to is Taylor Swift.
But actually about her, we know very, very little. Was she in love with Tom Lefroy? Like, I really doubt it, right? Because if Cassandra's destroying letters that are personal and significant and that she doesn't want to share with the world, surely her sister's unhappy early love affair would be absolutely like the first one she'd burn. Right? So Tom doesn't matter, right? Tom Lefroy is not the love of Austen's life, if she had a love. Because otherwise we wouldn't have, or certainly there's an argument for saying that if he was, we wouldn't have the letters, we wouldn't know about him, right? Even the kind of, overnight engagement, we don't actually know this stuff. These are just family stories. And they may have some basis in truth, but, people go around being like, oh yes, and she got engaged on the night of whatever it is, December the 2nd, 1802. Like, literally, this is her niece, who was not alive at the time, writing 65 years later, saying, my mother told me some stuff, and when I look in my mother's diary, there are some cryptic comments that make me absolutely certain that this is what you can't. This is not a level of evidence that permits us to build on it, right? This is a family tradition, right? And sure, let's talk about it as a family tradition, but to view this as some kind of fact, it can't. This does not have the status of a fact, right? But there are so few facts in Jane Austen's own life, and that's both a curse and a blessing. Enables us to make her into whoever we want. It's
complex. It's as complex as her characters that she writes, and I feel like that for me is so important in such a big takeaway, and also why I've just loved this conversation, because it's just expanded on what I already get from your books, and it just got me thinking, and the nuance, we've spoken about the military and things today, but your books covers things like education, women's rights, the difference between the countryside and the city, and there's so much in that. And when you start to unpick it, you find all of these little crumbs within Austen's books, and you're just actually. So if you've enjoyed this conversation today, guys, I really recommend picking up Helena's book, because you'll have these thought processes now. Every single chapter you read, you'll have more thought processes. Here it is, The Worlds of Jane Austen. Amazing. Do you want to tell everyone when it's coming out and what they can expect?
Yeah, so it is coming out on the 25th of September in the UK, and the 23rd in North America, if you have North American listeners. It's got loads of beautiful pictures. So it's got loads of illustrations, and it kind of it's sort of divided into chapters. So there's stuff about the education of women in particular, about the army and the navy, a little bit about the Austen family, about kind of all the agricultural and industrial and political revolutions that were going on, and it also has a lot about kind of afterlives. So there was Kipling, some Charlotte Bronte, famous Austen hater, also it goes on to talk about things like Sanditon and Miss Austen and Bridgerton right at the end there. So the kind of the ongoing Austen mania, and some of the really recent adaptations, and kind of how costume drama and stage drama is kind of moving on. So stuff like talk a bit about Ostentatious, and the amazing stage adaptation of The Watsons that they did a few years ago. So there's hopefully something in there for everyone. Yeah, it was such a fun book to write. It was really really enjoyable.
I love that. And if people want to just keep in touch with like what you're doing, where's the best place that people can find you?
Probably on Twitter at Mrs. Ashton Dennis, obviously inspired by the letter that Austen wrote to her first failed publisher, signed Mrs. Ashton Dennis. She was like mad.
I love it. No, thank you so much, Helena. I've honestly had such a good morning just chatting with you.
I've really enjoyed this. So, yeah, great. Thank you.
And that is everything from us today, and I will see you in another episode.